Blood stained the delicate white lace of Josephine Bennet's ceremonial gown, but it was not from the sacred ritual itself. The searing, agonizing heat of the Alpha King's bite still burned fiercely on the crook of her neck, a permanent, flesh-deep brand declaring her as the undisputed queen of the Lycan territories. Yet, as the deafening cheers of 1,000 aristocratic wolves echoed through the grand vaulted ceilings of Somerset Cathedral, Josephine was already slipping silently out the servants' postern door. She hoisted herself onto a stolen, cloaked horse, plunging into the freezing, rain-swept night. The entire kingdom celebrated the glorious union of William Ashford and his destined mate, completely unaware that their new queen had just become the most desperately hunted fugitive in the realm. Heavy rain battered the stained-glass windows of Somerset Cathedral, casting fractured, kaleidoscopic light across the cold stone floors. Josephine Bennet stood at the center of the dais, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was a mere border wolf, a daughter of the modest Bennet merchants from the Riverlands. Yet here she was, draped in velvet and spun gold. Towering before her was King William Ashford, the alpha of the northern reaches. His presence was suffocating, radiating a raw, dominant power that forced the entire congregation into a state of bowed submission. William's eyes, a piercing, unnatural shade of amber, were locked onto hers. There was a possessive hunger in his gaze that sent a shiver down Josephine's spine. For weeks, she had believed this was a fairy tale. The terrifying, ruthless king had found his fated mate in a commoner, sweeping her away from her mundane life into a world of unimaginable wealth and security. The high priest stepped forward, raising the ceremonial silver chalice. By the blood of the ancestors and the undeniable pull of the moon, 2 souls shall be forged as one. William reached out, his massive calloused hands gently framing Josephine's face. Despite his fearsome reputation as a warlord who had decimated the rebel factions of the East, his touch was surprisingly tender. "Mine," he whispered, a deep, rumbling growl that vibrated directly into her chest. He leaned down. Josephine tilted her head, exposing the sensitive skin of her neck. The moment his fangs pierced her flesh, a blinding flash of euphoria and excruciating pain ripped through her nervous system. It was the marking. The supernatural bond snapped into place, tethering their very souls together. She could suddenly feel his heartbeat echoing her own, his surging protective instincts, his overwhelming, possessive love. For a fleeting, beautiful second, Josephine felt utterly invincible. The cathedral erupted into roars of approval. The king had marked his mate. The kingdom was secure. The extravagant feast that followed in the great hall was a blur of roasted meats, overflowing wine, and the suffocating scent of hundreds of alpha and beta wolves vying for the king's attention. The overwhelming sensory input of the fresh mating bond, amplifying her hearing and smell tenfold, left Josephine dizzy. Pleading exhaustion, she begged William for a momentary reprieve to refresh herself. Reluctantly, the king kissed her newly marked neck, his eyes darkening with a promise for the wedding night, and allowed her to retreat to the royal washrooms, flanked by 2 guards. It was there, in the quiet, drafty stone corridors behind the great hall, that Josephine's fairy tale violently shattered. Slipping past her guards into an adjoining solar to catch her breath, Josephine heard hushed, urgent voices echoing from the adjacent study. Her newly heightened hearing picked up the conversation with terrifying clarity. "The marking is complete. The bond has fully formed," spoke a voice she immediately recognized as Chancellor Reginald, the king's most trusted political advisor. "Thank the ancestors," replied a second voice. "It was Dr. Thomas Arras, the royal physician. I was not sure His Grace would survive another full moon." The Ashford blight was advancing entirely too fast. His cellular structure was already beginning to collapse. Josephine froze, pressing her back against the cold stone wall, her breath hitching. "The Ashford blight? The girl? The Bennet commoner? She has no idea?" Reginald asked, his tone dripping with a clinical, detached cruelty. "None whatsoever," Dr. Arras confirmed. "The mating bond is a miraculous conduit. By marking her, the king has successfully tethered his diseased life force to hers. The blight will naturally siphon out of his bloodstream and transfer into her healthy system. King William will be completely cured by morning. And the new queen?" Dr. Arras sighed, a sound of feigned pity. "She will endure a month, perhaps 2, of agonizing internal rot. Her organs will slowly fail as the blight consumes her from the inside out. We will tell the public what we always tell them, that she succumbed to the severe winter sweating sickness, just like the king's previous 3 fated mates." It is a necessary tragedy to keep the Alpha King alive and the realm stable. One peasant girl's life is a small price to pay for the survival of the Ashford dynasty. A cold, paralyzing horror washed over Josephine. Her hands flew to her neck, covering the fresh, throbbing bite mark. The euphoric bond that she thought was love. It was a parasite. William hadn't chosen her because she was his fated mate. He had chosen her to be a sacrificial vessel. He was going to drain the life out of her to save himself. Panic, raw and blinding, seized her. The bond pulled at her, demanding she return to her mate's side, but the human instinct to survive screamed louder. She could not stay. She would not be led to the slaughter like the three women before her. Moving with absolute silence, Josephine tore the heavy, jewel-encrusted tiara from her head, leaving it on a wooden side table. She unlaced the restrictive outer bodice of her velvet gown, dropping it to the floor to allow for better movement. Clad only in her white underdress and a stolen servant's wool cloak she snatched from a hook by the kitchens, she slipped out through the scullery door. The rain was torrential, a blessing in disguise. It would wash away her scent. Josephine sprinted toward the stables, her bare feet slipping in the mud. She found a restless gelding, cut its tethers with a stable boy's discarded carving knife, and hauled herself bareback onto the animal. As she spurred the horse past the outer bailey and into the swallowing darkness of the whispering woods, a singular, terrifying howl tore through the night sky behind her. It was a sound of absolute, earth-shattering fury. The king knew she was gone. Inside the great hall, the celebration came to a sudden, violent halt. King William Ashford dropped his silver goblet. The heavy metal clattered against the stone floor, spilling crimson wine that looked entirely too much like blood. A profound, agonizing tear echoed in his chest, a psychic severing that physically doubled him over. The warm, radiant presence of his mate, which had been glowing in his mind just moments ago, had suddenly vanished into a void of stark, terrified static. "Your Grace?" Chancellor Reginald stepped forward, his brow furrowed in faux concern. William did not answer. His amber eyes bled into a luminescent, predatory gold. His claws extended, tearing through the fine silk of his gloves. The agonizing pull in his chest was not just distance, it was active resistance. Josephine was fighting the bond. She was running. "Close the gates," William growled, his voice dropping to a demonic, dual-pitched register that commanded absolute obedience from every wolf in the room. "I said, close the damn gates!" He vaulted over the high table, ignoring the gasps of the nobility, and stormed toward the royal washrooms. His massive frame practically vibrated with restrained aggression. When he reached the solar, he found only her discarded velvet bodice and the royal tiara resting mockingly on the table. He snatched the fabric, burying his face in it. The scent of vanilla, rain, and sheer, unfiltered terror hit his senses. Why was she terrified? Captain Nathaniel, the head of the royal guard, rushed into the room, falling to one knee. "My king, the outer guards, report a horse stolen from the stables." The rider fled north, toward the river docks. "Mobilize the trackers," William ordered, his chest heaving as the beast beneath his skin clawed for release. "Lock down the river. No boats leave. No wagons cross the border. Bring her back to me, unharmed." He grabbed Nathaniel by the collar, lifting the seasoned warrior off his feet. "If a single hair on her head is damaged, I will personally mount your head on a spike. Do you understand?" "Yes, sire," Nathaniel choked out. As the guards scrambled, William felt a dark, terrifying realization creeping into his mind. He was fully prepared to burn the entire kingdom of Ethelgard to the ground to get her back. Miles away, the freezing rain felt like needles against Josephine's skin. The horse was exhausted, its flanks heaving in the mud, but she dared not slow down. The mating bond was an active, living torture. With every mile she put between herself and William, an invisible chain pulled tighter around her heart, threatening to snap her ribs. Her body was craving her alpha, her biology screaming at her to turn back, to submit, to return to the safety of her mate. "Stop it," she sobbed, clutching her burning neck. "He's going to kill you. Stop." She reached the edge of the river Trent, just as the first light of false dawn began to bleed through the storm clouds. The river was swollen and angry, but she saw the faint, flickering lantern of a smuggler's barge, moored beneath the weeping willows. Josephine slid off the horse, slapping its hindquarters to send it running down the bank as a decoy. She stumbled through the reeds, the cold mud sucking at her ankles, until she reached the wooden gangplank of the barge. A man stepped out of the shadows. He was grizzled, smelling of cheap ale and wet dog, a rogue wolf. "We're closed, girl. River's too high." "I have gold," Josephine said, her voice shaking. She reached into the pocket of her underdress, pulling out a heavy emerald ring she had managed to slip off her finger during her escape. It bore the royal crest. The smuggler, Tobias, widened his eyes as he took the ring, inspecting it under the lantern light. "This is Ashford gold. Royal gold." He looked up, his eyes narrowing as he took in her soaked white gown and the fresh bleeding bite mark on her neck. "You're the new queen, the one the king just marked." "I need passage to the Southern Isles," Josephine pleaded, backing away slightly. "Right now. Hide me in the cargo." Tobias chuckled, a low, grating sound. He pocketed the ring, but instead of stepping aside, he drew a long, rusted hunting knife from his belt. "Passage? The king just put a bounty of 50,000 gold pieces on your head, little bird. Sent the message through the pack link not 10 minutes ago. Says his mate was kidnapped by traitors." Josephine's blood ran cold. Kidnapped. William was spinning a narrative to justify the massive military mobilization. "Nothing personal, Your Grace," Tobias sneered, lunging forward. "But a smuggler's got to make a living." Josephine reacted on pure adrenaline. She dodged his clumsy swing, picking up a heavy wooden oar resting against the barrels. With a desperate scream, she swung it with all her might, catching the rogue squarely in the jaw. There was a sickening crack, and Tobias tumbled backward into the raging river. Panting, Josephine dropped the oar. She scrambled to untie the heavy mooring ropes, her fingers numb and bleeding. Just as the final knot gave way and the barge began to drift into the turbulent current, the sound of deep, guttural barking echoed from the tree line. She looked up. Standing on the muddy bank, illuminated by the lightning, was a massive, pitch-black wolf, easily the size of a warhorse. Its amber eyes locked onto hers across the widening gap of water. William. He had tracked her himself. The Alpha King let out a roar that shook the very foundations of the earth, plunging into the freezing, violent river to swim after the departing barge. The River Trent was a churning nightmare of black water and splintered debris, swollen by the unrelenting storm. Josephine clung to the slippery wooden tiller of the smuggler's barge, her knuckles white, her breath tearing through her lungs in ragged gasps. Behind her, the massive, ink-black silhouette of King William Ashford carved through the violent rapids. He was gaining ground. His powerful strokes defied the lethal current, driven by an ancient, primal obsession to reclaim what was his. "Go, go, go," Josephine chanted frantically, throwing her entire body weight against the steering oar to guide the heavy barge into the faster central current. Suddenly, a massive, uprooted oak tree, swept away by the floodwaters, breached the surface just yards behind the boat. The collision was catastrophic. The submerged roots slammed into the king's wolf form with the force of a battering ram, dragging him under the frothing rapids. Josephine screamed, a terrifying mix of relief and an agonizing, bond-driven panic, tearing at her heart. She watched the dark water, waiting for him to resurface, but the river swallowed him whole. The agonizing pull in her chest instantly dulled to a hollow, aching throb. She had escaped, but the victory felt like swallowing glass. For 2 days and nights, Josephine drifted downriver, hiding beneath the damp tarpaulins. The physical toll of the marking began to manifest with horrifying speed. It started as a subtle tremor in her hands, followed by a creeping, icy numbness in her extremities. By the time the barge finally ran aground in the muddy reeds of the lawless border territory known as the Weeping Marshes, ugly, bruised-looking veins had begun to spiderweb outward from the bite mark on her neck, tracking down her collarbone. Stumbling off the boat, she collapsed into the dense, foggy marshland. Her vision swam, the edges turning a sickening shade of gray. As consciousness slipped away, the last thing she saw was a pair of worn leather boots stepping into the mud beside her face. She awoke to the sharp, bitter scent of crushed charcoal and yarrow. Josephine bolted upright, a scream dying in her throat as a wave of intense nausea hit her. She was lying on a narrow cot in a dimly lit, dirt-floored cabin. The walls were lined with dried herbs, glass beakers, and leather-bound medical texts. "Drink this, and do not vomit," a gruff voice ordered. A man stepped into the candlelight. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with a weathered face and sharp, analytical gray eyes. He held a ceramic cup out to her. "Who are you?" Josephine rasped, shrinking back against the wooden wall. "My name is Griffin Montgomery," he said, setting the cup on a stool near her. "I used to be the chief toxicologist for the Royal Guard. Now, I am just a hermit, hiding from a king who prefers his secrets buried. You, on the other hand, are the new Queen of Ethelgard, and you are dying." Josephine's hands flew to her neck. The bandages there were fresh, smelling strongly of astringent. "The Ashford blight," she whispered, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "Chancellor Reginald, he said the king marked me to transfer his disease. I'm a vessel to save his life." Griffin let out a harsh, barking laugh, though there was no humor in it. "The Ashford blight? Is that the fairy tale Reginald is spinning these days? Good God. They think the common folk are entirely brainless." Josephine stared at him, confused. "I heard them talking. Dr. Eris said it." Griffin pulled up a chair, his expression hardening. "Josephine Bennet, there is no such thing as the Ashford blight. It is a fabricated, biological myth." He reached over, gently pulling the collar of her gown down to expose the darkened, necrotic-looking veins branching from the bite. "This is not a magical curse transferring from your mate. This is heavy metal poisoning, specifically a highly concentrated dose of refined wolfsbane mixed with liquid mercury." Josephine felt the room spin. "Poison? King William is not sick. He is being systematically poisoned," Griffin explained, his voice low and urgent. "Small, calculated doses over years, administered by someone very close to him, likely in his wine or his meals. It weakens him, keeps his wolf form volatile, and makes him completely dependent on Dr. Eris for treatments." "But the transfer?" Josephine pressed, her mind reeling. "I felt it. He bit me, and I started getting sick." The mating bond is a biological miracle. When an alpha marks a true fated mate, their immune systems link. Your healthy body instantly detected the lethal toxins in his bloodstream and began pulling them out to protect him. "You are literally filtering the poison from his body into yours." Griffin leaned forward, his eyes burning with a fierce intensity. Reginald and Eris knew William would eventually find his mate. They knew the mate would absorb the poison and die, leaving the king devastated, unstable, and entirely under their political control. "They did it to the 3 women before you. They murdered them, Josephine, and they planned to murder you." The horror of the revelation was a physical blow. William hadn't marked her to kill her. He was a victim, just like she was. The King of the North, the most feared warlord in the realm, was a prisoner in his own castle, slowly being assassinated by his most trusted advisors. And because she ran, he was still in their clutches. "Can you cure me?" she asked, her voice trembling, but finding a new, hardened edge. "I can flush the mercury, and the charcoal will bind to the wolfsbane," Griffin said, preparing a new poultice. "But the bond is demanding. You return to him. If you stay away, the psychological severing will kill you just as surely as the poison. We have to purge your blood, and then you must go back." The great oak doors of the king's solar shattered inward, ripping off their iron hinges and crashing onto the stone floor. King William Ashford stalked into the room, a terrifying vision of unrestrained violence. His royal garments were soaked with river water and mud, his chest heaving, and his eyes glowing a solid murderous gold. He had survived the river, washing up miles downstream, half drowned and entirely consumed by the maddening void where his mate's presence should have been. "Out!" William roared at the terrified servants trying to clean the room. They scattered like mice, fleeing past Captain Nathaniel, who stood nervously in the corridor. William collapsed into a heavy leather chair, burying his face in his hands. The pain in his chest was a living, breathing monster. It clawed at his ribs, whispering that he had failed, that his mate was dead in the freezing waters of the Trent. Yet, beneath the grief, a cold, razor-sharp realization began to pierce through his clouded mind. Before Josephine fled, she had been in this very room. She had been safe. The guards were stationed outside. What could have possibly possessed a newly marked mate, whose biological imperative was to seek comfort in her alpha to rip off her royal garments and flee into a freezing storm? She was running from him. But why? William stood abruptly, his heightened senses flaring. He walked over to the adjacent wall, pressing his hand against the cold stone. This wall connected directly to Chancellor Reginald's private study. The stones were thick, but to an alpha wolf, sound carried. If Reginald had been in there with guests, Josephine would have heard everything. Driven by a sudden, sickening intuition, William stormed out of his solar and marched directly to the royal infirmary. It was the middle of the night, but Dr. Thomas Eris was at his desk, scribbling in a leather-bound ledger. "Your Grace." Dr. Eris jumped up, his face paling as he took in the king's feral state. "You should be resting. The river." William didn't speak. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides, grabbed the physician by the throat, and slammed him against the mahogany bookshelves. Heavy medical tomes rained down around them. "What did she hear?" William growled, his voice vibrating the glass vials on the tables. Sire, I do not know what you mean," Eris choked out, his hands clawing futilely at William's iron grip. "My mate ran away in terror. She abandoned the security of the pack and risked death in a flood. She heard something in Reginald's study, something you said." William's claws extended, pressing into the soft flesh of the doctor's neck. "Give me a reason not to rip your throat out right now." "We were only discussing your health," Eris gasped, his eyes darting frantically. "The Ashford blight. We were discussing how the new queen would cure you." William frowned, loosening his grip slightly. "Cure me? The blight is incurable. It simply goes into remission." Eris swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. "The bond, your grace. The mating bond transfers the affliction. We knew she would take the sickness from you, just like the others." The air in the room seemed to freeze. William dropped the doctor, staring at him in absolute, unadulterated horror. "Just like the others," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "You knew my mates were absorbing my illness? You let me mark them, knowing it was a death sentence? It was for the good of the realm," Eris cried out, scrambling backward. "You are the Alpha King. Your life is worth 1,000 peasant girls. Chancellor Reginald insisted we keep it from you so you would not hesitate to claim them." A blinding, earth-shattering fury ignited within William. He hadn't been losing his mates to a tragic winter sickness. He had been killing them. He was the weapon that murdered the women he loved. And Josephine. Sweet, terrified Josephine. She had overheard them. She thought he was a monster who intentionally marked her to use her as a human shield. "Where is the Chancellor?" William's voice was dead calm, a terrifying contrast to the beast raging in his eyes. "He rode out with the tracker units," Eris stammered, pointing a trembling finger toward the door. "He took the elite vanguard south, toward the Weeping Marshes. He said he was going to bring the queen back." William's blood ran cold. The elite vanguard was not a tracking unit. They were the king's personal executioners. Reginald hadn't gone to rescue Josephine. He had gone to finish the job. If Josephine survived the river, she would be weakened, sick from the transfer, and completely defenseless. The Chancellor would silence her before she could ever tell William the truth. "Nathaniel!" William roared, storming out of the infirmary. The captain of the guard rushed forward. "Sire, summon the loyalists. Anyone not tied to Reginald's purse strings. We ride south immediately." William grabbed his heavy broadsword from a weapon rack, his jaw set in stone. "The Chancellor is committing high treason. If he reaches my queen before I do, there will be no trial. I will slaughter every last one of them." Far to the south, the morning mist clung to the stagnant waters of the Weeping Marshes. Inside the hidden cabin, Josephine lay drenched in a cold sweat, her body convulsing slightly as Griffin Montgomery forced a bitter, black liquid down her throat. "Drink it all, Your Grace," Griffin urged, wiping a damp cloth across her burning forehead. "It will bind the metals in your blood." Josephine choked, coughing violently. The pain was excruciating, a fire burning through her veins, but the terrifying dark webs on her neck were slowly beginning to fade from black to a deep, angry purple. She was surviving. Suddenly, Griffin froze. He stood up, his gray eyes darting toward the single, barred window of the cabin. "What is it?" Josephine whispered, her voice raw. Griffin quickly moved to a wooden chest in the corner, pulling out a loaded crossbow. "Wolves," he murmured grimly. "And they aren't trying to hide their scent." The heavy thud of armored boots echoed on the wooden porch outside. Before Griffin could aim, the cabin door was kicked off its hinges, splintering inward with a deafening crash. 5 massive men, clad in the black and silver armor of the Royal Elite Vanguard, stepped into the cramped space. Their swords were drawn, gleaming wickedly in the dim light. Stepping through the center of the soldiers was Chancellor Reginald, his immaculate velvet robes completely spotless, despite the marsh mud outside. He looked at Josephine lying on the cot, a cold, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "Well, well," Reginald purred, stepping over the broken door. "It seems the river failed to do my job for me. What a resilient little vessel you are." Griffin Montgomery did not hesitate. With the swift, practiced reflexes of a former Royal Guardsman, he raised the heavy wooden crossbow and fired. The iron-tipped bolt tore through the damp air, striking the lead Vanguard soldier squarely in the center of his chest plate. The armor pierced with a sickening crunch, and the man collapsed backward into the mud. But before Griffin could reload, the remaining 4 soldiers lunged. One swung the flat of his broadsword, catching Griffin on the side of the head. The older man crumpled to the dirt floor, unconscious, a dark pool of blood immediately blooming beneath his gray hair. "Griffin!" Josephine screamed, struggling to push herself up from the cot. Her limbs felt like lead, the lingering effects of the purged poison still leaving her agonizingly weak. Chancellor Reginald clicked his tongue in mock sympathy, stepping over Griffin's prone body to approach the bed. He looked down at Josephine, his expression twisting into a sneer of absolute disgust. "A tragic waste of a perfectly good toxicologist," Reginald sighed, brushing a speck of dust from his velvet sleeve. "Montgomery always was a stubborn fool. He figured out the mercury compound 3 years ago, forcing me to banish him under accusations of treason. I suppose it is only fitting that I find him here, attempting to undo my life's work." "You poisoned the king," Josephine gasped, clutching the thin wool blanket to her chest. "You murdered his mates." "I secured the future of Ethelgard," Reginald corrected sharply. "William is a brute, a warmonger, driven by base instincts. Under my guidance, the council has grown rich. We control the trade routes, the taxation, the treaties, but an alpha king in his prime is impossible to leash. He needed to be weakened. The wolfsbane kept him docile, reliant on the council to run the kingdom while he suffered in his bedchambers." Reginald drew a slender, silver stiletto from his belt. The blade caught the dim candlelight, gleaming with lethal intent. "The mates were a necessary complication," the Chancellor continued, stepping closer. "Whenever his biology demanded he take a bride, we allowed it. The bond naturally filtered the poison from his body into theirs, buying him another year or 2 of life while completely breaking him psychologically. A grieving king is a distracted king. You were supposed to die quietly in your chambers, Josephine. Running away and surviving the river was terribly inconvenient." He raised the dagger, aiming it directly at her heart. "Do not worry, little bird. I will make this quick. We will tell the king we found you dead in the marshes, a tragic victim of the rogue smugglers." Josephine squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the piercing agony of the blade. Instead, the very earth beneath the cabin seemed to violently shudder. A deafening, monstrous roar ripped through the morning fog, a sound so filled with pure, unadulterated fury that the wooden planks of the cabin walls groaned and cracked under the acoustic pressure. The 4 vanguard soldiers instantly froze, the color draining from their hardened faces. They recognized that sound. Every wolf in the kingdom recognized that sound. It was the terrifying battle cry of the Alpha King. Before Reginald could turn around, the entire rear wall of the cabin exploded inward. Splintered wood, mud, and iron hinges rained down as a massive, towering figure breached the room. King William Ashford did not look like a monarch. He looked like a god of war, descended from the heavens to enact divine retribution. His royal armor was discarded, leaving him in a soaked, torn tunic that clung to his heavily muscled chest. His eyes were not human. They were twin spheres of blazing, luminescent gold. His jaw was clenched so tight his fangs visibly protruded, and his claws dripped with the rain of the storm he had ridden through. Flanking him through the ruined wall were Captain Nathaniel and a dozen heavily armed loyalist guards, their swords already drawn and thirsty for traitorous blood. William Reginald gasped, dropping the stiletto in sheer, paralyzing terror. "Your Grace, thank the ancestors you arrived. We found the Queen, but this rogue toxicologist—" "Silence!" William's voice was a physical shockwave, a dual-toned command that forced the 4 vanguard soldiers to their knees in absolute submission. William stalked forward, his gaze locked entirely on Reginald. The Chancellor backed away, stumbling over the debris, his perfectly composed facade shattering into a pathetic display of cowardice. "I visited Dr. Eris before I rode out," William growled, his voice dangerously low, vibrating with a lethal promise. "He was remarkably talkative after I broke his jaw. He told me everything. Reginald, the wolfsbane, the mercury, the mates." Reginald hit the wall, trapping himself. "Sire, please, it was the council." William didn't let him finish. With a speed that defied his massive size, the king lunged. He bypassed his weapons entirely, letting his beast take full control. His massive hand wrapped around Reginald's throat, lifting the treacherous Chancellor completely off the floor. "You turned my bond into a weapon," William snarled, his fangs grazing Reginald's face. "You made me the instrument of death for the women I swore to protect, and you dared to try and take her from me." With a sickening, definitive crunch that echoed loudly in the sudden silence of the cabin, William snapped the Chancellor's neck. He tossed the lifeless body into the mud, as if discarding a piece of trash. The king turned his glowing eyes toward the 4 kneeling vanguard soldiers. "Nathaniel, take them outside. Execute them. Leave their bodies for the marsh scavengers." "With pleasure, my king," Nathaniel replied, violently hauling the traitors out of the ruined cabin. Suddenly, the suffocating aura of the furious Alpha vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, suffocating wave of panic and desperate sorrow. William rushed to the cot, dropping to his knees in the mud beside Josephine. His massive, trembling hands hovered over her, terrified to touch her, terrified he might break her further. Josephine shrank back slightly, the trauma of the past few days still screaming in her mind. "Please," William choked out, a single tear cutting a track down his dirt-streaked face. The terrifying warlord was gone, leaving only a broken, utterly devastated man. "Please, Josephine. Do not fear me. I swear on my soul, I did not know. If I had known what the mark would do to you, I would have walked into the sunlight and let the blight take me before I ever let my fangs touch your skin." Josephine looked into his amber eyes. She didn't see a monster. She didn't see the cold, calculating king who viewed her as a vessel. She saw her mate, the other half of her soul, bleeding out from a wound that no bandage could fix. The mating bond, which had been a source of torturous pulling, suddenly flooded her chest with a warm, radiant light. The poison was gone. Griffin's medicine had worked. What remained was the pure, unfiltered connection between them. Slowly, her hands shaking, Josephine reached out. She bypassed his hovering hands and cupped his rough, stubbled jaw. "I know," she whispered, her voice raspy but steady. "Griffin told me, you are a victim too, William." William let out a ragged, shattering sob. He carefully wrapped his massive arms around her fragile frame, burying his face in the crook of her neck, right over the healing bite mark. He held her as if she were made of spun glass, breathing in the scent of vanilla and rain that he thought he had lost forever. The moment their skin pressed together, the bond fully snapped into place. A surge of miraculous healing energy radiated between them, knitting together her exhausted muscles and soothing the lingering ache of the toxins. "We are going home," William murmured into her skin, his protective instincts wrapping around her like a warm blanket. "I am going to burn the corrupt council to the ground. I am going to tear down every lie they built. And when the ashes settle, I am going to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you are the only queen this heart will ever serve." Josephine rested her head against his broad shoulder, finally letting the exhaustion pull her into a deep, peaceful sleep. She was no longer a hunted fugitive, nor a sacrificial vessel. She was the Queen of the North, the savior of the Alpha King, and the woman who would stand by his side as they brought a new, fiercely just era to the kingdom of Ethelgard. Did you hold your breath during that epic rescue? If you loved this thrilling tale of betrayal, undeniable fate, and the fierce protective love of an Alpha King, you will not want to miss what we have coming next. The story of King William and Queen Josephine proves that even the darkest deceptions cannot sever a true mating bond. What was your favorite twist in this story? Did you suspect Chancellor Reginald from the very beginning? Or were you just as shocked as the king to discover the horrifying truth about the royal poison? Let us know your thoughts and theories in the comments down below. We love reading your reactions. If this medieval werewolf romance kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. Share this video with your fellow fantasy romance lovers, and absolutely smash that subscribe button. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our upcoming real-life inspired fantasy dramas, steamy shifter romances, and epic royal sagas. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next thrilling adventure.
Hi, my name is Mountain Confessions, the owner and manager of Mountain Confessions. After watching the video, she fled after the marking ceremony. The Alpha King declared a hunt for his mate. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stood out to me most was the mix of fear, longing, and pride between the characters. Even in a world built around power and destiny, the story still felt deeply personal because it touched on trust and freedom. Sometimes people run not because they don't care, but because they're overwhelmed or afraid of losing themselves. I think that emotional tension is what made the story so compelling. Do you think the Alpha King truly understood why she ran? And if you were in her position, would you have stayed or tried to escape too? Stories like this make me think about how important communication and patience are, especially when emotions are running high, and misunderstandings can change everything. If this story stayed on your mind after watching, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional Alpha King stories with drama and tension like this, feel free to like and subscribe for more whenever you'd like.